Out of all the forms of ethnic and world music out there, Western music is one of those that fascinates me the most personally, especially as somebody who is not natively from the tradition. Now, possibly the aspect that differentiates Western music the most from other traditions is its usage, its obsession, its central obsession with harmony. Harmony, ever since the formation of Western music as we know it 500 years ago, has been the modus operandi of the tradition. It has been the raison d'être of the tradition. It permeates every aspect of the music theory, kind of like how blood permeates every vein in a human body. Harmony, in its simplest possible terms, is the combination of two or more different pitches. If you have two or more notes that are not the same, and they are willingly sounded at the same time in order to produce an aesthetic effect, you're dealing with a harmonic musical tradition. Note how I am insisting on the fact that it has to be willful, that it has to be sought after. Other musical traditions do have harmony that happens sort of incidentally, but Western music is one of the few traditions in the world that really seeks harmony as a sought after aesthetic purpose, as an aesthetic goal, and therefore has built music theory to accommodate that goal. Another thing that I have to clarify in terms of terminology is what I mean by Western music, because some people seem to think that the moment you cross into Greece from Anatolia, you are dealing with Western music. You're not. Most of Greek music is typologically categorizable alongside Middle Eastern music, Balkanic music, North African music, more than Western music. Western music does not mean any music that is geographically within the bounds of what is traditionally considered to be Europe. Western music, from an ethnomusicological point of view, refers to sets of typological features, musical behaviors that have arisen in the late Middle Ages and have solidified and taken shape in the subsequent centuries, especially from the Renaissance onwards. That's what we mean by Western music. Now, our story proper begins in the European Middle Ages, which is why I have invited renowned medieval musician from the school of Notre-Dame, Pérotin. Pérotin, merci beaucoup de vous être rejoint à nous aujourd'hui.
Ouais, c'est ça, va te faire foutre, gros con. Non, mais là, hein, putain, moi j'avais des trucs à faire, hein, parce que moi, tu sais, j'ai une vie, je voulais pas être ici aujourd'hui à la base. Mais là, mon maître Léonard, il me dit, ouais, non, vas-y, fais l'entrevue, ça va être bien pour l'école de Notre-Dame, ça va faire de la publicité. Alors me voilà ici à me faire casser les couilles par ce gros con avec sa gueule de SDF, wesh.
Merci beaucoup, Pérotin. To start, before we get to the actual Middle Ages, let's just have a quick word about the status of harmony before the European Middle Ages, because there's some things to say about that. Is there harmony outside of Europe? Is it a strictly European phenomenon? And did harmony exist before the Middle Ages in Europe? Were you to ask that question to Western academics 100 years to 200 years ago, many of them, if not most of them, would have given you an absolute, resolute, absolutely not. Harmony is unique to Europe. It always will be. It is our monopoly. It has existed nowhere else. And it is literally impossible for harmony to have ever existed before medieval Europe. We now know these two sentiments to be kind of ridiculous. First off, harmony has been noticed or detected outside of Europe many times. Well, first off, outside of Western Europe, because we think of harmony as a very Western European thing, but the Balkans have one of the most well-known traditions of harmony. If you know Bulgarian choirs, that's what it's all about. It's about harmony. Georgia has a very strong tradition of harmony. Sub-Saharan Africa has one of the most complex and rich set of traditions dealing with harmony. But the point being, whilst harmony is definitely not unique to Western Europe, it is, however, verticality. When I say verticality, you think of a melody. Bum ba da dum ba da da dum ba da 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 dum. You have notes, that happen one after the other. If you have harmony, you have notes happening at the same time, and so they're happening on top of other notes. They're layered vertically, right? That's what I mean by verticality. So when I use the term verticality in this video, think of it as overlapping effectively with the concept of harmony. Nowhere outside of Western Europe has harmony been pushed to that extreme. Western Europe is the musical tradition that has really cultivated the complexity of verticality to the furthest extent. So it's not unique to Western Europe, but Western Europe really has sort of, an almost, not a monopoly on the complexity of harmony, but really they're the ones who have pushed it to the furthest extent. However, when it comes to the question of whether or not there was harmony before the Middle Ages, the question, the answer to that is a little more complex. The answer is we don't really know. However, the previous stance of ethnomusicology 100 years, 200 years ago was it's impossible. We don't consider it to be impossible anymore. It's absolutely possible, however, there's no evidence for it. There's many clues that point to the Greco-Roman tradition, which is the only tradition that is really truly attested from antiquity, as being more vertical than previously thought. 100 years to 200 years ago, the typical attitude of ethnomusicology was to say that it was pure utter monophony and nothing else. Monophony meaning like you would have had 10 different instrumentalists and they would literally all play the exact same notes in unison. We now know this not to be the case. We understand Greco-Roman tradition to have been far more heterophonic in nature, kind of like modern Greek tradition. The modern Greek tradition, outside of the Ionian tradition, is for the most part a heterophonic tradition. You have one melodic line, somebody goes, Mi sirlu mu iglikya matia, and the oud player goes down 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 down, and the balama player or the saz player goes doing a tremolo. So they're all playing the same melodic line, the same melodic contour, but not doing the exact same thing in perfect unison. We understand Greco-Roman tradition to have been more like this. However, I really recommend this video by Michael Levy that really makes a good case as to why harmony may very well have existed in antiquity, that at least we have to be open to the idea of it. I don't necessarily share Mr. Levy's I believe they're more confident. I'm sort of more conservative on the question, but you also have the studies by Stefan Hagel and everything that show that they may have had an understanding of verticality that was more profound than we previously thought. Perhaps they knew about the possibilities of verticality, but just never really bothered. They weren't particularly interested in it, but they understood the concept that some notes are consonant with one another, that they meld together very well. But ultimately, the question of because here's the thing, okay, the Greco-Roman tradition we know was not principally harmonic. If it had harmony, it wasn't something that they ever wrote about principally in their music theory books. But outside of the Greco-Roman tradition, I mean, you have tens of thousands of musical traditions over the thousands upon thousands of years, hell, hundreds of thousands of years of prehistory as far as Homo sapiens existed. So the idea that harmony literally cannot have existed before medieval Europe, to me is kind of like saying that it is impossible that life exists outside of planet Earth. The odds of that seem to me very unlikely. However, at the same time, until we find evidence of life outside of the universe, we cannot claim that it exists. So it's kind of the case. So right now I would say the view of ethnomusicology is mostly, sure, we're not closed off, they're not closed off to the idea that harmony may have existed before medieval Europe, but the earliest known attestations of harmony in medieval Europe are then, therefore that is where we shall start our story. Alors, Pérotin, pourrais-tu, s'il te plaît, nous expliquer comment l'harmonie a émergé pour la première fois dans un contexte de l'Europe occidentale au Moyen Âge?
Ouais, bien sûr, je peux expliquer, gros con, parce que j'ai rien à faire de ma vie. Hein. Moi, je suis juste ici à me faire casser les couilles. Et là. Bon, alors, l'émergence de l'harmonie. I'm going to do it in English for your viewers. So, the emergence of harmony in medieval Europe. Well, it's synonymous with the appearance of organum. Okay, what is organum? Bon. Organum is the earliest known form of harmonization in the history of medieval Europe. Organum consisted of taking a pre-existing religious chant. So, for example, the Ave Maris Stella. Ave Maris Stella Dei Mater Alma atque semper Virgo Felix Eli Porta. So that's the Ave Maris Stella. Now, we believe that originally in the Middle Ages, all chants were sung monophonically. The earlier you go back in the Middle Ages. So you could have had 50 different people singing the exact same melody. They're all singing the same melody at the same time, on the same beat, the same pitches, etc., etc. Maybe at different octaves, because they don't have the same voice register. Some have a lower or higher voice register, but they're all singing effectively the same melody. And then organum arrives. Now, organum in the 800s must be understood as a strictly ecclesiastical thing. Maybe it was also secular, maybe it had a secular origin even, but we don't know. The texts that we have allow us to know about the ecclesiasts. They're the ones who write mostly about the music. So as far as we're concerned, it's a mostly ecclesiastical thing, if not uniquely ecclesiastical. Now, what organum was. So, we've established that harmonization is the production of different pitches at the same time. What organum is, you have Ave Maristella or any other chant, a pre-existing chant. You have somebody singing it unaltered, as it is, which is what we call the vox principalis, la voix principale, the main voice. And then you add a second voice, which is called the vox organalis, la voix organale, la voix qui harmonise, the harmonizing voice. How does this voice harmonize? Very simply put, it sings the exact same melody, but transposed to a fourth or to a fifth. Sings the exact same melody at the same time as the vox principalis, but the vox organalis is singing it to a fourth or a fifth. That's literally all it is.
Ok, je vais t'arrêter ici, Pérotin, 2 secondes, pardonne-moi s'il te plaît, mais il faut vraiment que j'explique ça à nos viewers. So I'm gonna just explain that to you very quickly. He's talking about transposing to a fourth or to a fifth. Let me take the time to explain this. If you're a musician, if you already know what that means, you can just skip to this timestamp. However, for those of you who are not musicians, it is absolutely important that you understand this. Now, what does it mean that the vox organalis was transposing to a fourth or to a fifth? The vox principalis will be singing Ave Maristella in a certain tonality. What that tonality is can be anything. For example, it can be this one. This tonality. What that means, what does it mean that Ave Maristella is being sung in this tonality, which in this case is C? What it means is that the feeling of completion, the feeling that the melody has resolved, must occur, will and shall occur on this note. This is the note that will give a feeling of resolution to the melody. If you were to sing Ave Maristella in this tonality, then this is the note on which Ave Maristella, the melody, will feel resolved. That's really the easiest way that I can put it for people not into music theory. So let's suppose that I want to perform Ave Maristella in the tonality of C, this tonality. Then it's going to go like this. See, now it feels resolved. It's gone home suddenly, right? When I was doing this, it feels like, are we going to go to the supermarket? And it feels like, okay, you've just finished. It's like an incomplete phrase, basically. So that is what we refer to as the tonic. This is not absolute. You can play Ave Maristella in any other tonality. I can play it in this tonality, and then if I play it in this tonality, that is going to become our tonic, our root note that gives a feeling of finality. So I'm going to go. And now suddenly this is the one that feels like it has finalized the melody, even though a minute earlier, this very same note was the one that felt like an unfinished question, a phrase that was not complete. And I can go. Oh, and now, see. Now, if I keep pressing this button, that used to be the tonic, that used to be the one that gives us a feeling of finality, suddenly now has a feeling of incompletion, right? So that is what it means to sing in a certain tonality. So the vox principalis is singing in a certain tonality. Now, what is a fourth or a fifth? Ave Maristella is built out of a minor scale, what in medieval church terminology would have been called the Dorian mode. What is the Dorian mode in C? from the tonality of C, if C is your tonic, then the Dorian mode looks like this. These are the tonalities that you use in order to create Ave Maristella out of the tonality of C. If the tonality you are using is another one, like this one, D, then the Dorian mode looks like this. But let's suppose, for the purposes of this demonstration, that the vox principalis is singing in this tonality. So now we are looking at our mode. Our mode looks like this, and we can see that there's a sequence of intervals. There's the first, there's the second, there's the third, there's the fourth, the fourth, and this is the fifth. So we have identified the fourth and fifth intervals. So what does it mean to transpose the melody to a fourth? In the simplest of terms, that the vox organalis will be singing Ave Maristella in such a way that the feeling of conclusion will now occur on the fourth. That is what it means to transpose to a fourth. And so then it's going to sound like this. See, I have now played the melody in such a way that the feeling of conclusion has occurred on the fourth interval of the Dorian mode, if the tonic is C. So back to Pérotin.
Ouais, c'est ça, coupe-moi la parole aussi, hein, parce qu'on m'invite, hein, on me fait perdre mon temps et en plus on me dit de fermer ma gueule. So to give you an actual practical example, I'm first going to sing the Ave Maristella again as the vox principalis. So we are going to assume that the vox principalis is singing it in this tonality. Ave Maristella de mater alma, atque semper Virgo, felix eli porta. Now I'm going to transpose it to the fourth, the upper fourth. Ave Maristella Dei mater alma, atque semper Virgo, felix eli porta. So now I've transposed it to a fourth. Now obviously you have to imagine you have two different people singing it, so you would have heard their voices overlaid. So now if we overlay their voices, we get this effect. Ave Maristella Dei mater alma, atque semper Virgo, felix eli porta. And now you've just heard organum in its most basic common form. They also did it in fifths, so if I were to sing it in fifths, it would go Ave Maristella Dei mater alma, atque semper Virgo, felix eli porta.
Merci beaucoup, Pérotin. Maintenant, beaucoup de personnes ayant entendu cette démonstration que tu as faite de l'organum pourraient avoir la réaction que ça sonnait étrange, ça sonnait bien weird. Tu sais, que genre, je suis pas habitué à ce genre d'harmonie. Pourrais-tu nous expliquer pourquoi cette réaction pourrait arriver?
Well, no, it's true, for sure. Some people will hear this. Okay, so if they say this, they're not from Georgia or from the Balkans. They're probably used only to Western European music, probably classical musicians. You have to understand this kind of harmonization. You are dealing with consecutive harmonies. You are dealing with consecutively the same harmonic intervals. Fourth, 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 or fifth, 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 fifth. This kind of harmonization has not existed in Europe for the better part of 500 years now. It's completely gone. Basically, ever since the Renaissance, the style of harmonization that was in vogue, was to selectively produce specific harmonic intervals at specific places in the melody. So for example, in Renaissance music, it's like we are going to do a third ear and a second ear and a sixth ear, right? So it's kind of like more precision strike. You're not consecutively just doing the same harmonic intervals. You're specifically targeting specific intervals at places that are sort of naturally well sounding for the melody, if you will, given the aesthetic tastes of Western European music. And for the most part, that's how harmony has been. So just consecutively using fifths and fourths is like very unusual for European music, has been for 500 years. So that's probably why it would sound weird for some people. Especially consecutive fifths is, is a big taboo of the classical style. J'avais été invité à faire un concert à Lyon en 2003. Il m'avait dit, ouais, Pérotin, vous pourriez nous faire une petite démonstration organum. Venez dans votre machine à voyager dans le temps, venez à Lyon. Alors c'est ça que j'ai fait, je suis allé à Lyon. On l'a fait à notre manière. Après, t'avais les gros trous de cul de mes deux couilles, là, les musiciens classiques. Ouais, c'est relou, vos harmonies en 5, putain, c'est de la grosse merde. C'est la grosse merde, mais voilà, je nique ta mère aussi, hein. Ah ouais, non, tu critiques la musique médiévale, tu critiques mon bled. Tu critiques mon bled, tu veux clash. Mais c'est bon, tu veux clash, ça va, tu veux clash, on se donne rendez-vous à Marseille. T'amènes tes potes, j'amène mes potes, 4h du matin à Marseille. Glock, Kalash, couteau, comme tu veux, on fait ça comme tu veux. On va bien clash sa mère, wesh.
Merci Pérotin. Puis ma prochaine question, ça serait, en fait, on a parlé du fait que l'organum s'effectuait en intervalle harmonique de 4 ou de 5. Pourquoi pas de 3 ou de 2 ou de 1 par exemple? Pourquoi juste la quatrième ou la
Oh,
cinquième?
mais le revoilà avec ces grosses questions, la con, putain, bon. Why the fourth and the fifth? Well, there's a bit of a universalist response that you can give, answer that you can give. The fourth and the fifth, not to go into too much music theory, they are what we call the perfect intervals. You can research that on your own, it's going to be too long to explain. Basically, they're like the most naturally equal or symmetrical. They're the most naturally consonant intervals. Like if I were to do the same thing organum, but like in seconds or in thirds. Even somebody who is not a lot into music can tell that. Maybe it doesn't sound bad to you, maybe you think it sounds good, but you can tell that it sounds dissonant. It doesn't sound as naturally consonant as the fourth and the fifth. And it's also sort of cultural taste. Basically, if you want to just keep doing the same harmonic intervals consecutively, the fourth and the fifth are naturally the ones you're going to do them with because they are the perfect intervals. Although I knew an English musician, j'avais fait un concert à Carcassonne pour un duc, tout ça, Monsieur Pérotin venait faire de la musique et il y avait elle jouait la vielle à roue. Une anglaise, vraiment une bonne musicienne, hein, incroyable instrumentaliste, très belle voix. Putain, elle baisait bien en plus. Hein. Oh, elle baisait bien, sa mère. Oh, on a baisé, mais 12 heures comme des chiens en chaleur toute la nuit. Elle m'a dit, she told me that they had a thing called the Gimel, which was like based on thirds. I don't know much about it. I would say go check this source, which is linked in the description. One of the main sources for this video. So they had something, but it's really unique to England and Scotland, as far as we know. For the most part, organum must be understood as something that was of the Latin Catholic Church, and it was in fourth and fifth.
Right. Puis la dernière question que j'aurais pour toi, en fait, ça serait... y avait-il d'autres manières d'effectuer l'organum, en fait, à ses débuts? Y avait-il d'autres techniques à part celles que tu as démontrées jusqu'à maintenant?
Ouais, je te dirais, le dernier truc qu'on a, the other thing that we could talk about in basic organum would be drone organum. We have some textual attestations of drone organum, which we understand and interpret as being, drone harmony is singing the same note constantly, basically.
Ouais, je vais t'arrêter ici encore. Pardonne-moi vraiment. But I'm going to have to stop you here because this is something interesting to talk about. Drone harmony. Now, drone harmonization is personally my favorite form of harmonization. It's the one that I find to be the most simple and beautiful. It's the one that is most characteristic, for example, of Balkan harmony. For example, what you have is you have somebody singing the main melody as it is, and then the harmonizing vocals, what they do is they repeat the same note, the tonic, right, the root note, the one that makes everything feel at home when everything ends. They repeat that throughout most of the song. And then when moments of cadence arrive, when there's moments where the melody feels like it's going towards a sort of conclusion, the harmonizing voice switches to the subtonic, the note before the tonic in the scale, And then once the conclusion comes back, they switch back to the tonic. That is probably the most common form of Balkan harmony there is. If you hear Bulgarian or Serbian songs, usually that's how they're going to be harmonizing. Rosna livada, trava zelena. Rosna livada, ajde more, trava zelena. And the harmonizing voice is going to go Rosna livada, trava zelena. Rosna livada, trava zelena. Rosna livada, trava zelena. Rosna livada, ajde more, trava zelena. As an example, you also have the same in Georgian music. Tarinani nani nano, 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 tarinani nani nano. That's a very basic form of harmonization. It's very simple, but it's also very effective, and I find it to be really beautiful. Right, so what we've looked at so far is the earliest emergence of harmony in the form of organum, as it was in the early Middle Ages. And what becomes very clear is that we are dealing with a world of parallel harmony. What do I mean by parallel harmony? When you look at the vox organalis, it has no independent will of its own. It has no independent existence of its own. It is utterly and completely subordinate to the vox principalis. It is the exact same melody, only transposed to a different tonality, but it does the same thing, sings the same notes, the same relative intervals on the same beats. It imitates the same thing. Think of it as two dancers. The main dancer is on a lower platform than the dancer that imitates them, who is on a higher platform, but they're both doing the exact same dance at the exact same time. They're only décalés, as we say verticalement in French. They're only, offset by like verticality, but otherwise they're paralleling each other's movements completely. But as the Middle Ages go on forward, we see a desire of medieval Europe to experiment more. When Western Europeans back then understood that, we've got our hands on something. We have to go, deeper with this. And the first instances of that are the church explicitly stating that it's okay to mix the fourth and the fifth. You have to understand, organum, it always had a strained relationship with the church. There were passages in the Psalms that claimed that only, praise to God can only be sung in one voice. Some interpreted it to mean like only one person singing. Nah, it must be only one melodic line. And so, there was always, it was a medieval church. Yeah, it's something new. They were kind of like not necessarily keen on, obviously conservative. But it was like an on and on relationship. But at some point, they're like, okay, fine. Not only can you do organum, you can mix the fourth and the fifth. Ave Maria Stella Dei Mater Alma Atque semper Virgo Felix Eli Porta. And then maybe they mixed in the drone harmony with it, the tonic, overlaying it over the typical organum that is switching between fourth and fifth. Ave Maria Stella Dei Mater Alma. And then maybe they even added a drone of the fourth or the fifth. So repeatedly, if somebody is transposing the melody up a fourth, another voice is repeating only the fourth to strengthen that harmonic relationship. Ave Maria Stella Dei Mater Alma. So what you are seeing is things slowly starting to become less rigid and more complex in a quantifiable way. We are starting to develop more independent harmonic lines, overlaying more voices with one another, being more creative with this. And then possibly the most important thing to happen is development of the rhythmic modes. Rhythmic modes are basically a skeletal pattern of how a melody is situated in time. I'm going to give you a very stupid example. Let's say, for example, that a rhythmic mode is bum, ba bum, 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 ba bum, bum, bum. Like, there's no pitch, right? It doesn't give you the pitch. All it tells you is whatever pitches you're going to sing or write down, they're going to happen in this rhythmic manner. Bum, ba bum, 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 ba bum, bum, bum. So it can be mi sirlumu iglikya soimatya bum ba bum 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 ba bum bum bum. Right, it's the bum ba bum 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 ba bum bum bum. It's the same thing. It's just you're changing the pitches, or you can go bum ba bum 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 ba bum bum bum. Right, different melody, but the same rhythmic mode. So you understand what I mean, right? That's basically what the rhythmic mode was. It was a skeletal pattern of where the notes of the song are going to fall on which beats, basically. Simplest way that I can put it. And once you have the introduction of rhythmic modes, something incredible happens. Now you can write completely independent vertical melodic lines. See, what happens is, up until then, organum was always people singing in parallel motion. But now you can have somebody sing Ave Maria Stella, and then the vox organalis can go Ave Maria Stella. Like, again, I'm pulling these examples out of my ass. They probably won't work musically, but you understand what I mean. Like, the vox organalis now is doing completely different beats, like singing notes on different beats that are offset, that don't exactly match that of Ave Maria Stella. With the introduction of rhythmic modes, you essentially have the introduction of fully fledged independent vertical lines that aren't subordinate anymore to the vox principalis. And at this point, you can't really talk about vox principalis and vox organalis anymore. You can't even talk about organum anymore. Organum has evolved into something different. Now we are dealing with the full-blown polyphony of the European Middle Ages, of the late European Middle Ages. Polyphony is the existence of two or more fully independent melodic lines. Each of them on their own can be a melody of its own, but they can then be placed together. But all of that was made possible through the developments of the late Middle Ages, especially the Ars Nova. The Ars Nova was a musical movement pioneered by the likes of Pérotin and Léonet that really built off of the earlier harmonic developments of the Ars Antiqua. But with the Ars Nova, you really have the full-blown exploration of actual polyphony, and none of it is represented better, in my opinion, than by the musical work of the Middle Ages to end all medieval music, in my opinion, La Messe de Notre-Dame de Guillaume de Machaut. It is rightly regarded as possibly the highest musical achievement of the entire Middle Ages. I believe it to be one of the greatest pieces of human music ever devised. 4 voices, each of them an independent melodic line of its own that could be just a chant of its own, but the 4 of them interacting together to create this incredible superstructure that creates specific harmonies at specific times. This is what you have to understand. We have now moved past parallel harmony. You don't just have fourths all the way through and fifths all the way through. He is writing 4 different melodic lines, and they converge at different places in order to produce specific harmonies. Here I want a third, here I want a sixth, here I want a fifth, here I want a second, etc. And the demand for such precision generated a paradigm shift. By that point now, standard notation and written down scores that are precise become very important. I remember, I've made this point. Go watch that video for more information, but basically, earlier European music of the Middle Ages was not tied to the written score. You could write down melodies, but you weren't going to play exactly what was on paper. Written down melodies, like they are today in Middle Eastern or Greek or Balkanic music, they're a guideline. You kind of hit those notes, but then you do your own thing, You don't just go bam, pa pam pam pam, param pam pam. You go mi sirlumu iglikya soy matea, and you ornament and everything. You do whatever you want, You kind of go with that guideline, but the oud is doing its own thing and everything. That was how European music worked. European music used to be more similar to Middle Eastern music. Complexity and sophistication and the skills were found in spontaneity, in improvisation. But a paradigm shift occurs at the point where you now need to create specific melodic lines running in parallel that create specific harmonies. You need to write everything down, beforehand. And this creates the paradigm shift in which we are still today in Western music. Western music today, at least the art forms, the Romantic period, the Classical period, it is defined by the sacrosanctity of the written score. It is what some call the cult of the written score. Classical musicians, that's what they miss about medieval music. For a long time, classical purism really deformed and disfigured Baroque music and earlier forms of European music because classical tastes and norms were projected, and it's still happening, and I'll make an entire video about this. And by the time the Renaissance comes in, you really need to write down things for the demands of polyphony, and by the time you reach Mozart's era, you are now dealing with the fully fledged world of the written score. That's something that really shocks a lot of people. A lot of people are like, wait, you can't read any notation, and you have this entire, musical channel and musical career. I'm like, yeah, but the idea that you need musical notation, it seems like a given from a European classical perspective, but that's unique to them. 99% of world music was perfectly functional and very much complex in its own right because they were complexities that did not require writing them down. This idea that how can you not write or read music is preposterous. Music is an acoustic thing. This is something that is specific mostly to the Western European tradition because of the demands of vertical complexity where you need certain harmonics to happen and everything. That is what ushered in written notation. But the conflation that many people do with written notation equals complexity is simply false. Written notation is something that allowed this specific kind of complexity. All right, so let's look at French Renaissance music, which is, as far as I'm concerned, the absolute best Renaissance harmonic music that there is. Is that because I'm French Canadian and I grew up in France and I'm completely fucking biased? Yes, absolutely. So we're looking at Le Tourbillon, which I've made on this channel. You can go watch the video. It's really, really fun clip. We had a lot of fun filming it with my friends. So it's made up of 4 different voices, singing effectively 4 different melodies. So you have the soprano voice. Quand je bois du vin clairé, à mi tout tourne, tourne, aussi désormais je bois un jour boire. You have the tenor voice. Buvons bien la buvons donc, à ce flacon, faisons la guerre. You have the alto melodic line. Le bon vin nous a rendu gai. And you have the bass melodic line. Buvons bien, buvons mes amis, trinquons, buvons, vidons nos verres. And when you put them all together, it sounds like this. Quand je bois du vin clairé, amis tout tourne, aussi désormais je bois un jour boire. Quand je bois du vin clairé, amis tout tourne, aussi désormais je bois un jour boire. What this example shows us is a case of typical Renaissance polyphony, which is different melodic lines written in a specific way where the convergence of the melodic lines at specific points creates specific harmonic intervals and effectively specific chords. Of course, we can all tell just by looking around that the great polyphonic obsession of Europe has ended. There's no more great polyphonic music being written every day. Most Western music does not sound like that anymore, does not work like that anymore. In fact, Western music, for the most part, now has a single melody that is recognizable. That is in many ways more similar to the status before the late Middle Ages. In the early Middle Ages, that's how European music was. It was only one melody. But the harmonic progression was kept. This whole idea of the chord progression, of the harmonic progression, that was a result of polyphony. These aspects, we've kept them. And now we are in the era of homophony. Homophonic music, is when you have a melody, one melody, not 6 at the same time, really just one main melody. That's the one that people are going to focus on, but it is underlined and supported by a harmonic progression, by a chord progression. And the importance of chord progressions in Western European music becomes such that, you know, in modern Western European music nowadays, the really interesting thing is, I know Western musicians, friends of mine, you know, here in Quebec, who have been brought up in the Western tradition, and they start with a chord progression and they write a melody based on the chord progression. To me, as an Iranian musician, somebody from a purely melodic background, somebody who, you know, I almost never use harmony. I'm fascinated by it, but I also don't, you know, it's not necessary. You know, music is perfectly possible without harmony, which is why this interview by Ben Shapiro was pretty laughable. I mean, musicians, you know, ethnomusicologists have made fun of it already, where he's explaining how rap isn't music, and he says because there isn't any harmony. Like, that's one of the reasons he gives. By that definition, no music outside of the Western European tradition since tonal harmony in the 16th century can be considered music, which is unfortunately a view that a lot of people have, that I've talked about in this video and that I shall make a dedicated video about. The point being, to me, it's kind of incredible, right? This idea that you can actually, you know, write everything based on the harmony. But it really is interesting because you look at Western European music, where in the Middle Ages, it starts as a melodic tradition, a tradition that is involved with the development of melody. Out of this melodic tradition rises harmony, and that harmony comes to such a point, comes to such a dominant central role that it then supersedes the role of melody to the point where now melodies are generated from harmony as its core. You know, my friends who are more into pop music and everything, they start with chord progressions and create harmonies afterwards. I know this sounds normal to Western musicians, but again, just, you know, I'm trying to convey to you an alternative viewpoint, which is that of me as an Eastern musician. It's incredible. I'm not judging it. I think it's really cool. It's just something that I find to be very, very foreign for me, as it is just as much foreign for them that I can write entire, you know, 1 hour music pieces and not use chords once, you know, and they're like, what the fuck, how is it possible? It's different ways of making music. That's why the world is beautiful. We have a lot of diversity. Anyway, I will be finishing the video with these thoughts. An important detail to keep in mind is this is one half of the picture, and the other half can be found in this video and also this video. These three videos together combined will provide a fuller picture, in my opinion. I've talked at length in these other videos about how, for a very long time, the historiographical narrative of the development of Western music was one where Western music of the Middle Ages was presented as being simplistic and primitive, as lacking any form of complexity, that they just sang one melodic line. Wow, it was so primitive. And finally, polyphony comes. Finally, complexity has arrived. Complexity existed, but in another manner before, microtonally, ornamentally, in forms of improvisation, in terms of using the melodic line in a more sophisticated manner. The melodic line was indeed the only thing that existed back then, but that melodic line was complexified through sets of musical behaviors that today's Western musicians, with their current educational set, they don't have the skills to generate it. And so what I would say is just watch these other videos for a broader picture, because this video may give this impression that was held for a very long time that, oh, you know, it was primitive and finally it became sophisticated. The actual, you know, the more scientific consensus as to the development of Western European music was that it started out having one form of complexity, and the complexity changed. You went from a complex system to another complex system, only in a different way, not a simple linear story of technological advancement where, you know, you went from primitive to complex. So absolutely do go watch these videos. I think they will give a broader and fuller picture.
Anyway, this was Pérotin. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and ouais, non, allez vous faire foutre, putain. Allez vous faire foutre, hein. Ouais. À votre grosse YouTube à la con. Moi, j'en ai pas besoin de YouTube. Sa mère. Moi, je viens du Moyen-Âge. Au Moyen-Âge, on faisait ça comme des vrais, pas de YouTube, pas d'Internet. Allez, je l'encule, votre génération de merde, avec vos TikTok, je sais pas quoi, wesh. Représente, wesh. Ars Nova, École de Notre-Dame, représente, wesh.